Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are diving into something that is literally a game changer. We're unpacking a fascinating framework based on some incredibly deep insights from top psychologists and mental health experts. I am so excited to share this with you because the core promise is just wow. It's essentially the ultimate cheat code for your career and your relationships. We're going to see how mastering your internal self-worth completely transforms how you handle the external world. Fix the inside, and man, the outside world becomes so much easier to navigate.
So let's start with a really relatable question. Have you ever wondered why we sometimes just sabotage our own success? Or why we completely freeze up or fail miserably at a negotiation even when we know all the facts? Well, it's not just bad luck, and it's definitely not a lack of preparation. The answer actually lies in this crazy link between the physical biology of your brain and what experts describe as a communication zoo. Because here's the reality. If you can't regulate your own internal state, you have absolutely zero chance of regulating an external interaction.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be covering 1. Koujeto sebehodnota. 2. Mozek a koření sebehodnoty. 3. Praktické kroky a cvičení. 4. Typologie, nástroj pro pochopení. 5. Vztahy a výběr partnera. And finally, 6. Vnitřní stabilita pro kariéru. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. Koujeto sebehodnota. What is self-worth?
So psychologists and mental health experts really emphasize a crucial shift in how we think about this. Self-worth is not just some passive trait you're magically born with, and it's definitely not a fixed feeling that you either have or you don't. Actually, it's an active, daily psychological process. It is your locus of control. And research shows that this internal process robustly dictates your long-term psychological resilience. We're talking about impacts on everything from your physical cardiovascular health to how you handle a basic rejection in a boardroom. Think about it. If your self-worth is low and you aren't managing it, you're going to constantly seek external validation just to fill that gap. And that leaves you incredibly vulnerable to stress and burnout.
Moving to Section 2, Mozek and koření sebehodnoty, the brain and roots of self-worth.
You know, self-worth actually has a very distinct physical signature in your head. There's this interconnected system called the default mode network, or DMN, which basically handles your inner monologue and your sense of self. In a high self-worth brain, experts see highly efficient metabolism and connectivity in the DMN and the precuneus. It's like a good news reporter. It integrates praise naturally, processes failure constructively, and accurately reports the facts of reality. But in a low self-worth brain, that DMN acts as a terrible reporter. When you're stressed out, it completely dysregulates. It literally traps you in these severe rumination loops, taking one tiny little failure and falsely predicting that your entire future is doomed. It completely undermines your long-term psychological resilience.
And surprisingly, that network usually gets programmed way back in childhood. You know how babies have to learn object permanence, like realizing a toy still exists even when you hide it under a blanket? Well, we go through a similar process to develop the concept of permanent emotion. If things go well, a kid learns that even if a parent gets angry or leaves the room, the love and safety are still there. But if that emotional development gets disrupted, the child's brain gets conditionally wired. They grow up into an adult who feels their worth only exists under very strict conditions. And it's this exact childhood wiring that makes us so highly susceptible to stress during high-stakes negotiations or tough conversations later in life.
Sekci 3. Praktické kroky a cvičení. Practical steps and exercises.
Okay, so how do we actually fix this conditional wiring? Well, you have to treat your brain like an empirical scientist. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, gives us a brilliant framework for this. Let's say a stressful thought hits you, like I am totally useless at this job. Don't just passively accept it. First, explicitly identify that negative core thought. Second, actively search your memory for a factual counterexample, a time you actually succeeded. And third, reframe it into a realistic alternative. Doing this daily is the secret to building long-term psychological resilience. It is the exact neurobiological process that allows you to consciously regulate your internal emotions when you're under massive stress. And one of the absolutely most powerful mindset shifts you can make here is just tweaking your internal vocabulary. By replacing demanding musts with empowering choices, you instantly get your agency back. Saying I must be perfect creates an immediate biological stress response, but saying I choose to do my best, that shifts your locus of control away from all those crushing external pressures and puts it right back onto your own internal values. You're basically grabbing the steering wheel right out of the hands of your inner critic. To really build this internal certainty, there are a few daily exercises that are incredibly effective. First, try writing a letter to a friend who is in your exact same situation. It works because it immediately bypasses your harsh inner critic. We are almost always way more compassionate to our friends than we are to ourselves, right? Another game changer is visualizing your specific, detailed, best possible future self. Your brain desperately needs a positive target to strive for, because if you don't actively create a positive future in your mind, your stressed-out default mode network is just going to default to inventing catastrophic, anxiety-inducing ones.
Section 4. Typology, a tool for understanding.
Now, once your internal state is secure, it's time to master the external world. And the absolute key to managing stress during complex negotiations is what we call the zoo metaphor. Imagine walking into a zoo and trying to feed hay to a lion. I mean, it's not going to work, the lion's going to be confused, and honestly, you're probably going to get bitten. Well, the exact same rule applies to humans. Understanding which animal you are talking to and feeding them the specific communication they actually need is the real secret to completely frictionless interactions. Psychologists use these high-contrast character anchors to help us navigate this. Take the lion, maybe a super dominant executive or a tough client. They feed on ego, winning, and respect. So your strategy isn't to fight them, it's to praise them and present solutions so they feel like they got the win. Then you've got the Sheldon Cooper type. Think of a highly analytical engineer who feeds on tiny details and rigid rules. If you don't bring hard data and extreme patience, that conversation is going nowhere fast. And finally, the bureaucrat, the administrator who strictly demands correct procedures. Don't get frustrated, just cooperate and politely hand over the missing forms. When you have high internal self-worth, you won't take their rigid demands personally. You just read their typology, regulate your own emotions, and speak their language to get the result you want.
Section 5. Vztahy a výběr partnera. Relationships and choosing a partner.
As you'd expect, this whole framework heavily dictates our personal lives too. Romantic partners usually fall into 3 broad categories: caring, who want to nurture you; inspiring, who want to lead and shine; and stressing, who constantly drain your energy with complaints. Real-world psychology shows us that low self-worth dramatically complicates how we choose and communicate with our partners. For example, someone with a really harsh inner critic might subconsciously choose a stressing partner simply because that chaotic dynamic matches their own negative internal reporting. But if you do that internal CBT work we talked about, you build a secure baseline, and that prevents you from falling into the trap of choosing an incompatible, stressful partner.
Sekci 6. Vnitřní stabilita pro kariéru. Internal stability for career.
Let's bring this into the workplace. Think about a stressed-out leader who has a dysregulated internal state. They usually only communicate in one rigid style. They basically try to feed hay to every single animal in the corporate zoo. And when it inevitably fails, they take the pushback incredibly personally and start blaming the team. But a truly stable leader, they have the psychological bandwidth to flexibly speak multiple typology languages. Because their internal stability stops them from taking disagreements personally, they can objectively adapt their approach. This one dynamic directly drives the efficiency, the trust, and the psychological safety of an entire team. So, what does this all mean for your bottom line? Experts suggest that mastering this inside-out framework, basically conquering your own mental narrative and adapting to the typology of others, can profoundly impact your measurable outcomes. We're talking about increasing your career success and negotiation conversion rate to 8 out of 10. That is a massive, massive leap compared to a baseline of maybe 2 out of 10 if you're just relying on default, emotionally uncalibrated interactions. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Think about your life right now. Which animal, whether it's a boss, a partner, or honestly, maybe even your own inner critic, are you currently feeding the wrong food to? And more importantly, armed with these psychological insights, how are you going to apply the inside-out framework tomorrow morning to completely change that dynamic? Thank you so much for exploring this totally fascinating topic with me.